for me, you can afford to spend all your time in building the new, because you in so doing, you will see that you can fix the old in a completely new way than the way it's been presented to you until now.
Can we really unite people to create systemic change? This is the question that will be the guiding focus of our conversation today on the Elevate podcast with our special guest, Indra Adnan. Now, Indra is the founder of The Alternative UK. It's a political platform that asks the question, if politics is broken, then what is the alternative? During the course of this conversation, we explore the practical challenges of getting people to come together to unite, including the division and polarization amongst society, how we can find greater harmony in order to bring people together to start to explore systems change, and how we can ultimately move towards a parallel society where we can explore new ways of living, new political systems, new modes of new media, new ways of economic thought, and so on. This is a deeply insightful conversation. Indra and I share many things in common, and over the recent months, we have both sought different ways of bringing people together on a local basis in order to start to impact change. So I'm sure you'll enjoy this episode. I'm delighted to say that Indra will be featuring at the Camp Out event coming up this weekend in the Mendips. So if you're already joining us, then look forward to sharing Indra's session with you on Sunday afternoon this weekend. If you don't know about Camp Out yet, it's a 4-day experience in the Mendips where we're exploring social and personal transformation. There'll be talks, debates, music, healing, well-being, a whole range of activities indoor and outside for all the family in the sun, in the Mendips. You can find out more at campout.live. We're hosting it in collaboration with Campfire Convention, Inspire, The Little Chill, and Elevate have been asked to curate the program on Sundays. So we've got a whole program of talks and experiences for you coming up on Sunday afternoon. I do hope to meet some of you there. Find out more at campout.live. If you enjoy this conversation for Indra today, then please do come and join us in the Elevate Network, our private social community, where we are exploring concepts just like this and how we can go about creating systemic and political change. You can find our community at weareelevate.org. I hope to see you there. For now, enjoy today's conversation with Indra Adnan. Welcome, Indra, to the Elevate podcast. It's great to have you here. I think there's a lot of similarities in terms of what the Alternative and Elevate are trying to do in terms of systems transformation, looking at the relationship of the individual and our agency and how we can all play a role in altering and transforming the world around us. It's a real pleasure having you here on the Elevate podcast. Lots to explore.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I'm so excited about this.
Now, I would like to make sure our listeners and our audience have got a kind of backdrop or a background context to what led you to starting the Alternative. So could you tell us a little bit about your adventures and journey to date that led you to beginning this project?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the question is how far back do you want me to go? But just let's keep it contained. I am a psychotherapist. I'm an author. My background is really working in conflict transformation. I've worked in the arts for the same reason. But at a certain point in my life, I decided to go into politics, meaning thinking, where is our agency? That's my biggest question. That's a sort of framing question for my life. And later on, perhaps we can go back into why that is the case. It was very much to do with my childhood, the things that I had to face. But it led up to this exploration, a period of time when I was trying to understand the difference between what I call hard power and soft power. I worked in that arena for a while. But then at some point, I had to face the thing that everybody was telling me: you don't make any changes happen unless you're in the world of politics. So I started to look at that, and I was part of a political think tank for about 10 years called Compass. Some of your listeners may be familiar with that progressive think tank. And I even stood to be an MP at one point, but it was a growing disillusion with the dysfunctionality of politics, which crescendoed, actually, I would say, on the day that Joe Cox was murdered. And I thought everything that I knew to be wrong about our political system comes together at this moment, when somebody is murdered for their opinion, on a question that nobody even really cared about several years before, by someone who knows nothing about that person. And this kind of essential division, the social division that our political design and culture creates, is the very thing that we need to overcome in order to solve all the other crises that we're facing at this time. So then I founded this party called the Political Platform, sorry, specifically not a party, the Alternative. And, you can ask me whatever you like about that, but it really exists to answer the question, if politics is broken, what's the alternative? It's been going for 5 years. We've come to some conclusions. It's not the never-ending question, what's the alternative? And now we're doing some specific things to move into a different idea of politics for the future.
Wow. Okay. So there's a few things I'd like to unravel from the get-go then. So within your story, you referenced a kind of igniting moment in your past. You've obviously given a recent moment that led you distinctly on this path. In terms of this journey around personal agency, was there an inciting incident or an igniting moment that took you on that journey?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, it was something that was almost obscure to myself. I didn't really know what was at the heart of my own journey until I wrote a book recently called The Politics of Waking Up. And my editor, the wonderful Mina Salami, some of your readers will know her, looked at the book that I'd written and said, "Well, it's quite good, but I don't know where you're really coming from, and who is the person who has this political vision." So I had to force myself to go back into the question of, why am I this person, and where did it start? And it was two things really for me. One was my parents my father's Indonesian, my mother's Dutch. I was born in Holland. And at the age of 3, we traveled to England. And although we were in quite a good position to do so, my father had a good job and so on, nevertheless, we experienced what it was to leave home and then become an immigrant in Britain. So there was that aspect of losing your belonging, losing your nation, you losing your identity and having to start again somewhere that wasn't necessarily that friendly to you on principle. So there was all of that, which was very important for me. And I realized I grew up as an outsider to the society I was trying to, thrive in. But the second and probably more important thing was that at the age of 11, my brother died in a car crash. And I remember really praying to God, for him to survive, and he didn't survive. So at a tender age, I was in this losing all sense of, where does power lie? What can I do, about my own life? What difference could I have made? And and obviously I was very immature, just young. But it became the theme of my life, actually. And all through my teenage life, my mum had 7 brothers and sisters, 6 of whom died of cancer while I was in my teens. So I was up against this. What is death? What is the limits of, human agency? What can one do in the face of that? Really colored my whole childhood to the point that I made up my own religion, as kids do when they're adolescent. And I was following my own religion until I went back to Indonesia when I was 21. Well, actually, I was a bit younger, and found Buddhism for the first time. So this is, and I'm a lifelong Buddhist now. So this idea of where does our agency lie, I have found answers for myself, but the wider social question of where does our collective agency lie, what can we do, obviously has grown into something so vital as a question for our society, because we're now facing, for one reason or another, species ending crises. These are not problems anymore. We're talking now about the survival of our species. Plus, even before the environmental crisis, that was happening all the time for different parts of the world. It's just that we're now paying attention to it in the north, in the white west, so to speak. But it has always been the case in different parts of the world, and even for people living within our societies, that's been the case. So how all of these things come together, I would say, personal and collective agency, but at the planetary level, that's the small thing that we're addressing.
Yes, the small thing we're addressing. Well, there's actually some interesting parallels on my own journey, I suppose, with my own personal relationship with power, and feeling mine was an internal sense of disempowerment. I struggled with my own limiting beliefs, fears. I was a skinny redhead growing up and had all kinds of challenges as a result of that. And always was the quietest kid on the sidelines. People don't believe me when I say that now, because I'm always giving speeches and speaking 24 hours a day on a podcast, but never found my voice. And finding my own inner power has been a journey that I've been on for a long, long time. But it came from a sense of feeling powerless. And it's interesting. Over those years, I've realized that sense of powerlessness can come either from within or from outside. When there's an adverse, when there's a horrible situation, like losing a loved one, like you've shared, where you desperately want the situation to be different, but you feel unable to alter the trajectory. And similarly, I've come and danced with politics for the last 10 years and almost gone into politics and just pulled back every time I thought, no, actually, I think I can do a better job of influencing from the outside, which is what's led me to create Elevate. And obviously, you've created the alternative, and these are platforms to stimulate discussion around some of these things. The piece that I would like to land upon is around this division and polarization that you touched upon, because I think we are living in a deeply fragmented world right now, and we are facing a multitude of challenges, but we're like children scrapping in the playground. Meanwhile, we have all these issues in the world, but actually the scrapping in the playground, the polarization, has actually become one of the dominant issues that's preventing us moving forward. So I'm curious to kind of learn of your observations around polarization and how that's affected your thinking in starting the alternative.
So one of the growing awarenesses for me when I was watching and observing, the political culture and structure and being in the think tank, so having that kind of, relationship to political parties, was this, conviction that really it doesn't matter what we the good guys, it doesn't matter who you are really. You believe that you're working with the good guys, right? But we the good guys, whoever they may be, we can have really all the solutions, because let's face it, the solutions do exist. There are solutions to the climate crisis, right? There are solutions to social justice. There are solutions. But we can have all of these solutions and still fail, because we're not paying attention to the fact that we can be divided really at the core level. So if we are divided, in our society, then it doesn't matter if you get 51%, of the vote, even if you get 60 or 70% of the vote, there's enough people still that can sabotage you. And they can sabotage you because they've been hijacked, if you like, or harnessed. Their power has been harnessed by those people who don't want you to succeed, right? And the people who don't want you to succeed are the ones who are already invested fully in the current socioeconomic political system that we have, notably based on what we would describe as the growth economy. So the growth economy, still is the dominant economy. It's still extracting from the planet what it needs for its own flourishing at the expense of the planet itself. So we're all heading towards the cliff. We know this, but some, the people who are really benefiting from that are quite happy to keep going, because they're thinking that they themselves, they will be the people who can survive any apocalypse. And so, it's just that it's an inbuilt, system doomed to the survival only of the fittest, but something that is by design going to continue unless we intervene on the design level, right? So what we're trying to do, and one of the main areas that we knew very quickly we would have to work on, is that how do you heal that essential division or dividedness of our communities and our society, so that like a very deep cut, in your flesh, if you just try to heal it at the top, it will just keep, going bad on down below. And that's what's been happening. It gets worse underneath the skin, however much we try to stitch it up at the top. So we knew we had to go down to the community level, which is exactly the place where people were experiencing over with Brexit. That's exactly where they were experiencing the divide now. So if before Brexit we were thinking broadly left versus right, or broadly privileged versus underprivileged, or these were quite broad, kind of. Now, Brexit did the uncanny thing of dividing us, even in our own families. Even within partnerships, people had different views. I mean, it was psychologically so successful in dividing people from each other and creating and causing chaos. And the people who could most benefit from that were the people who, in a way, had designed the space and knew what it was that they were trying to achieve in the long run. And I don't mean necessarily David Cameron but, in the long run, we've seen leadership arise around the world over a period of time, and that would have included Trump and Morrison and Bolsonaro and others who were just hell bent on this continuing with the fuel, the fossil-led fuel economy, and some form of easy leadership, being able to use populism as the way to achieve that. So all of this meant that unless we not only began to heal communities at the right at the community level, but create a pattern of how to do that could be picked up by communities anywhere, that became the focus for a while. So we did that by first of all, we started to think about what do we need to prototype, and we started to prototype in Plymouth and Devon something that we were calling a community agency network, right? But the funny thing is as soon as we started to prototype that, we saw that, in fact, these things were everywhere already. And that's been our pattern. Our pattern is to say, what we need is this. Oh, it already exists. And then, so the alternative became like a systems convener, noticing what it was that was really already there and what's already arising, and how our job was more to do with connecting the dots and telling a new story about this thing that we see already appearing. Mm-hmm. Long answer.
No, it's given a really strong context, and to be quite frank, Elevate has come to the same position in terms of a platform, a catalyst that connects things and helps amplify and fortify the things that are already in existence. So I think there is a lot of similarities there. Now, yes, this polarization piece, it feels. I mean, Brexit was the first time I really experienced that magnitude. But since then, we've had huge social polarization around, yes, Trump was another one, COVID, now Ukraine, it's the latest rulings in America. It feels like there is a machine that understands how to continue to perpetuate these divides. And it almost feels like now we live in this completely reductionist world where on any given issue, there's only 2 points of view, and it's team A versus team B. And you've got to pick a side, and all the complexity and nuance and all the multitude of ways of seeing things are kind of brushed aside to take these two dominant polarizing positions, which forces people into this, particularly in this digital realm, where you've got to show your support for those who see the world the same way as you do, and you've got to go and attack the ones that don't. And it's created this, particularly online, again, a very toxic environment where, I watched this, and I've made this reference several times, and I can't remember the film, but there was a film from the 1980s, and I remember the character opens the door in the room, and behind the door is this like guns being shot. It's this war taking place behind the door, and they quickly shut it. And it's like, every time I go on Twitter, it's like that. It's like opening the door to a war zone, but a verbal war zone where we're, hating upon each other. And it's really, I found myself to be part of. I've been part of that problem over the 10 years, where I've picked a side, and I've been very, having spent 20, 30 years of my life not feeling empowered enough to speak up. Now, I said to you before we started, I've kind of been making up for lost time, but I've almost come to the other side of that now and thinking, okay, I'm actually perpetuating this issue. Whilst I feel empowered speaking about the issues I feel strongly about, I think it's okay to do that if you can do it in a way that invites people into a discussion. But actually, I don't want to be further dividing society. I want to be able to create a space where we can actually engage in meaningful discussion. And the idea, people say there's always two sides to every coin. I say, well, if you pick up the coin and look at it sideways, we've got this entire rim around the outside, which is not only a third side, it actually represents an infinite amount of perspectives on something. So I'm curious about, when it comes to developing alternatives, how we can create that space where because the alternative pursuit, it's the alternatives, it's like all of these multitude of perspectives. How do we break down that animosity that comes with the division, because it's heated, it's vitriolic, and coming back to a place where we can engage.
So I want to start with slightly changing the terms of the debate, and meaning, I think when people imagine polarization, they imagine two things, like one line, connecting, 2 points of view on the same thing.
Yes.
My sense is that is not how polarization is achieved. My sense is that it's achieved through identifying two different forms of agency and making each one, because you've identified two groups of people to whom something quite different is important.
Yes. And
then you oppose them, but they can't meet because they're looking for different things achieved. Right now, let me give you an example. With Brexit, what happened was the desire for autonomy versus the desire to work together with others for the sake of, a bigger result, so to speak. But that desire to work with others, to be able to share tools, collective intelligence, whatever, and to see your place in the world, is very different from the need for autonomy. They clash. And when you try to then address a political conundrum, you're actually wanting two very different things from the same, from the same offer.
Yes.
So I found all the time that people who were Brexiteers would say, "You don't get it. You don't get it," and the other side would say, "You don't get it."
Yes.
Because they really, and it's true.
Yes.
Neither of them really understood the other's need at all. One needed more control over their own life. The other needed more results. Right? A parent would be able to say, "You can have both of those things."
Yes.
And there's a way to have them both at the same time. But the polarization effect was to fan the flames so strong on each of these things that they couldn't hear each other at all. I mean, nobody could bring them together because there was no interest in that, because one side had to win. Right? So, and I find that more and more, that when we're working in community, to take a kind of what I would call an integral approach. Now, you know what I mean by that because we've studied the same things, but some of your readers won't know that. What I mean is in the integral teachings talk about different forms of agency. I'm not going to go into the, I think, very distracting ladder, problem with that, but let's call them different forms of agency. So in any community, you might get a sort of the people who are protesters, who feel impassioned and inflamed, and because they know something is wrong, and that's their focus, is to correct what's wrong and to feel the passion of that. And then you get what I call the institution builders, the ones who really want to emphasize nothing is more important than that we understand what are the pillars of society, what is the education system, what are the institutions we need to build. That's their whole animus. They don't mind the protesters, but they say, no, well, that's important, but this is more important. And then you've got the people who are looking at overviewing, and all they're thinking about is strategy. So the strategists are, again, in a very different mindset from either the protesters or the institution builders. They think you have to be nimble and put things together and be clever in order to win. And then you have the people who are more like the human rights. The most important thing is social justice and to be able to respect everyone. Now, when you put these four kinds of people in a room, they talk right past each other.
Yeah.
They don't, because all of them think that what they need is the thing that needs to happen before the others happen.
Yes.
Right? And that results in nothing really happening. And that's the fragmented aspect of our political space, is people constantly talking past each other. And then on top of that, this kind of left versus right thing, which, is supposed to somehow explain all of this, but really doesn't explain it at all. Because there's plenty of each of those four kinds of people in both left and right parties. And, the human vulnerabilities that you were describing, this journey from lack of agency exists in all of these places. So there's so many dimensions of it. And then the question you asked me is, how can you bring this together? Well, our way is to develop, we've got a process called the collaboratory, which is a 4-step process to try to literally bring people who are living in the same place into relationship with each other. But it's much closer to, somebody said beautifully the other day, how you would plan a wedding. You're thinking about how would you plan a wedding so that everybody gets to feel comfortable, but they all have a good time. That's the way that we try to plan the collaboratories. And then they go through these 4 stages of coming together slowly and then facing the future and then becoming practical about it. So the stages are, it's called a friendly, an inquiry, and then the building of a community agency network, and then how those connect to each other. So we've actually taken these 5 years to develop some sort of a process, but all of it is around, at the core, what you're asking about, Dan, which is human relationship, how that, the very spark that futures become possible through, where is the agency in that group, and then what do we choose to do? Building together is the way to overcome these polarization. When you've got a good project to work on, it doesn't matter what your opinions are, because they fold into the building process.
Yes, thank you. I've got a lot here. There's a lot to extract. So I'm reminded of an example I used to use in the training rooms when I used to do business consulting, and that the task was to decide how to split an orange. You have an orange and there's 2 people, and you've got to decide how to divide it up because they both want the orange. And you'd get these always dealing with creative people. They come up with all these creative solutions, but generally always miss the point, which was to understand what each person wanted the orange for. And one person wanted the orange for the peel to put on their compost heap, and the other person wanted the orange to create juice so they could juice it. And the reality is they could both have that outcome by one having the peel, the other having the flesh, so they can make the juice. And every time you get to the conclusion, there's like this it's almost like this aha moment where we can both have what we need if we understand what the needs are. And this point around you made, and I've come to this realization the last couple of years in terms of the kind of left-right divide. And use American terminology more so as kind of progressivism. You've got one group who want progress, but the kind of little c conservatism is about preservation. So how do you marry progress and preservation? If you only want to progress or you only want to preserve, you're going to end up in some serious conflict. But if you understand how you can get the juice and the peel, how you can preserve and you can progress at the same time, and find where those alignments are, then there's some real power in that. But interestingly, looking at some of these divides, I've actually spent some time actually inspired by integral thinking, looking at the polarities of masculine and feminine, Eastern and Western culture, right and left politics. And when you actually draw them out on a map, it's fascinating to see how many parallels they are, whether you're looking at the comparisons between Western ideologies, masculinity, and right-wing politics, femininity, East, left. And again, these are generalizations, but you can see these polarizations, this polarity within the characteristics that are embodied. But what's fascinating is, you said about Brexit, people falling out, the same happened over COVID. It's because we forget that it's those opposites attract piece, where those opposite polarities is what draw us together in the first place. But when it comes to this kind of heated environment where we've got these external stimulus, the media and the organizations that want to maintain the status quo because they are the ones that hold the power, then it's almost, they can see the dry tinder, they light the fire and the flame and off it goes, and all of a sudden we're falling out. And that for me is really interesting to understand how we can start to understand those tensions, because there is progress and preservation. There's going to be tension.
Yeah, I mean, there's something around, if we spoke really slowly, both of us, that then we would be able to pick up everything that you're saying, because there's so much in what you're saying, right? But let me just go to the point of what I only recently really clarified for myself, is that we shouldn't be, we shouldn't be against. Polarization is a very specific word, but we should never be against disagreement. Disagreement has energy in it, right? And if you think about a cell, without which we cannot, we wouldn't be humans at all. But within any cell is a positive and a minus. That's where the energy comes from. So we should learn to treasure the disagreement. I think that's really core to what we're. But then, how do we create containers in which disagreement can be productive ultimately, right? And unfortunately, once you create that container, it starts to die. Right? It's like when a family goes beyond its sell by moment, and really it should have dispersed by now. And each one of the kids should be somewhere else making their own families and spaces of disagreement, right?
Yes.
So it's not an easy thing to hold. And if you become the holder of that thing, like you are, for example, even in your podcast, you are a rare thing for a brief moment, right? You can't be that forever, but for a moment you're going to hold all of this tension in this space. You can't expect everyone to see what you're seeing. That's the important thing. I don't know if you ever read, Frederick Laloux, Reinventing Organizations, but he was the person who talked very convincingly and wrote a book about what, again, in integral we call teal. Yes. The teal mentality. Now, the teal mentality, for, again, anybody who's not listening, is really being able to hold the space for all these other kinds of agency and create the conditions in which they can self-organize. So if you think that you have to organize them, that's a problem, because they won't agree with you. You just have to create the right kind of container in which they can organize themselves. So hence, ideally, instead of finding only people who agree with each other, projects arise in your community in which people who don't agree with each other somehow are working together, but they find ways to organize themselves. And I want to bring in here Peter McFadden and Flat Pack Democracy, which you probably know about, and also connected actually with other people you've mentioned. But he said, and again, for those who don't know who that is, Peter founded Flat Pack Democracy, which was a movement, if you like, of independent councillors taking over a local council and finding themselves around a table with people from the local community who decided they didn't want to be part of any existing political party, but be a group of independents. And they'd find themselves around a table with ex-Tory councillors, ex-Lib Dems, ex-Greens, now in this independent grouping. And they would routinely disagree about everything. All right? I mean, that's the point.
Yes.
But they were all focused on what's the best thing to do for the local community, because that's how we got voted in, because we promised we'd do that, right? And there's two things that they would do. One is they routinely invited people to participate in decision making. So they always had this very wide group of, but within themselves, they just developed the ability to sort of shrug off their own previous position. And I love Peter telling the story about, we'd start off with a disagreement, sometimes it became an argument, and then slowly somebody would explain better to somebody else where they were coming from, and they'd show you the result of what it is and how this would work out better. And then somebody would go, oh, okay, I get it, sure, go ahead.
Yes.
And those small words is really where it should be, right? That's where we want it to be, where people give way a little bit because they see what you're talking about and they're willing to give something up so that something good can be done. That should be how we overcome the divides, but there's no way that's going to happen. Why? Because A, we don't have these containers. They don't exist. And B, it continues to be in the interest of political parties for you to be divided so that you choose one over the other, and a media that has a business model of, you buy into the divide. You need to know, what am I supposed to be thinking? Who's the enemy? Who's the other? That's how they sell their papers, right? And that's their business model. So we're trapped.
Yes.
Because of lack of these containers. And so all we're trying to do, as much as we can, is to build these containers where people of different ways of looking and thinking can meet each other and get down to that, ultimately that thing of, oh, go ahead, you do that. I'll do this instead. That's human potential.
Yes, yes. I'm curious to know whether your ventures into Buddhism have actually informed some of your work on this, because really, in many ways, we're talking about dualism in the sense that, is this or that, A or B, left or right. And there is actually a non-dualistic way of potentially looking at this. I like the elegant beauty of the way you said the parent would just come in and make sure both kids are happy. And it's like, is that the metaphor for non-dualism? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, okay, now we're into another world, which I love your dexterity, and let's hope I can rise to that. But for me, non-dualism is slightly different from that. So I think what you're talking about is going beyond the duality of apparent division. I would say for me that's more like a transformative possibility, right?
Yes.
Non-dualism to me is when you spiritually no longer see any difference between yourself and your environment. It's like, you are at one with the whole environment and you can relate to the whole thing. But for me, that kind of spiritual way of being is the promise of Buddhism. It's like the sense of what is the Buddha? It's this ultimate non-dual entity, right? that can see the whole. But there's a distinction between the Buddha and the Bodhisattva, right?
Yes.
The Bodhisattva lives in this real world of life is suffering, everything is dualistic. That's the game, right? You're playing that game now. And so therefore, the Buddha himself left his palace. Actually, it was a bit of a transgender sort of entity, and became this person engaged in real life. And so we have to face the dualism. We live through night and day, backwards and forwards, yes and no. That's how we experience life, through dualism, through binaries. But the task, I think, is to keep transcending the binary, right? So, and that is the creative potential of everything all the time, right? So I would say with your orange description, and I hope you can go with me on this, and it's not conflict resolution is when you can divide the orange, right? So people come to a table and they agree they're going to divide the orange, but sometimes it's not possible to divide the thing that's at stake. And what's required is, and sometimes when you do divide it, somebody feels they got a less good deal than the other, right? So dividing the spoils, for example, or making compromises over power struggles. They often sow the seeds for ongoing conflict after you've left the table. But that's conflict resolution. It has some very important results, but it's actually also limited. Conflict transformation, on the other hand, is when the thing that you came together around as the problem, you can hardly see it anymore in the solution. You've transcended the problem. It's not in the solution. You've gone beyond that now. So, for example, I need a quick example, but with the oranges, for example, you might find that there's a new process for enjoying oranges that you're all going to be in together,
yes.
Right? Or that there's a different farming method that would provide what currently looks like orange peel to one of your parties, but really the thing is you're going to be in this different farming process together now. Or in the case of a borderland dispute where people were trying to decide how much of the resources on this side of the border do you get, and what are the real obstacles to us being able to trust each other. So instead of actually dividing the resources, this conflict transformation resulted in a park that spread across this border. And just for 5 years, people just had a space to come to get to know each other, play together, meet each other's families. And then the problem didn't exist anymore. It was very easy after that to divide things up, and they started to help each other out better because there was relationships between them. So for me, that's the thing you're trying to achieve, is to not really solve the problem, but to get beyond the problem. This is what, with Buddhism, when you are growing up, the problem you're trying to solve as a 12-year-old is just irrelevant when you're 15. It's not that you solved the problem. You just can't believe you have the problem.
Yes.
It's like, who cares whether, so-and-so likes me or not? It's like, so it's that kind of development. It stops being about problem solving and starts being about your own, what in my Buddhism we call our own human revolution. How I'm growing as a human being to be able to look at the rest of the world in a different way. So now I'm looking at the world in a different way. And I think that comes back to something you were saying before about how can we achieve this. And I would say the greatest part of what we need to achieve around equality or the crises that we have is not that we fix the problem, but that we learn to look at everything in a new way. And mostly to be able to look at people that we previously couldn't see really as people at all, as as the source of, as the source of our solutions. They are our resources. The people who excluded are the resources we need to solve the problems we couldn't solve. So.
Yes. I mean, I actually captured this as a quote from one of your other interviews. I think you said to know who you're not talking to and begin that conversation.
Yeah.
I resonated with that because in my previous work working with startups and entrepreneurs is that some of the very best innovations came from when you would have that diversity of perspectives, when people work with people who they're not used to working with, and that's how you actually come to solutions that weren't yet even on the page. That's when you do transcend the problem and into a solution space, which leads me to think in terms of the alternative and thinking in terms of political change, this idea of balancing, moving away from the problem that we are familiar, the problems that we can become intrinsically familiar with, and moving towards something more desirable. It feels like we spend a lot of our time, I've spent a lot of my time over the last couple of years focusing on the problem, really trying to understand the terrain, the root causes and interconnections with other problems on this occasion before moving on to the solution. But I've noticed more broadly that seems to be a pattern within society, and it's a very different example. But I remember one of my closest friends, she went through a breakup, and when she was ready to start dating again, I asked her, what are you looking for in your new partner? And she quite happily listed off the 5 things that she didn't want. So she's fully aware of the problems that she's previously been through. And I said, well, what do you want? She said, I don't know. I said, what if you just flipped those things and did the opposite of those things? She said, oh, oh yeah, I do want that. Yes, that's what I want. How then, when we talk about alternatives, building new systems, how do we, in your view, is there a balance between kind of fighting the old and building the new? How does this play out in terms of the way that you operate at the alternative?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a really great question, and I think it's a core question because this brings us back to the 2% thing, right? So, only 2% of people are members of political parties. And what does that mean? It means that only 2% of people think it's worth their time and money to invest in the narrative, that political parties offer. What they're saying matters, and what they're saying we must do. Only 2% of people want to get behind them and do it. So what's happening with the 98%?
Yes.
That's what I'm saying. What are they spending their time on? And we spent, the first 5 years, as I said, really looking into what are people really motivated by, and what actually is, the most, fertile spaces of development that we should be investing in, because that is actually where the energy is. And I think that's in a way, that's the balance. How much time should we be trying to fix the problems created by the 2%, or what the 2% say is the problem?
Yes.
Right? So they're framing it for us. This is the problem. What are we going to achieve by fixing it is my question. Right? When we finally get our ex-government, whether we're on the left or the right, really? Has it proved to be the case that we have now fixed the problems? It's a lifelong thing for me. I haven't noticed that that's the case, right?
Yes.
Getting your party in has not been the solution.
No.
It doesn't matter which side you're on. We still seem to be stuck in the same level of development as a whole society, unable to really. So I would say, taking your friend's thing, this idea that we are really powerless as human beings to fix the problem, let's flip that over. That's the thing you flip over and think, well, what if we were powerful? And then ask, how can we develop our power? Well, for me, this is what we should all be on, that journey of trying to work that out for ourselves. And I think we have been doing that, right? So I think of the last 30 years as the revolution that has already begun. And I say 30 years because the internet just gave it a lot of visibility. and therefore accelerated everything and made a lot of the things possible that we didn't know we were even missing, right? So we didn't know that we didn't have access to all this information, and now we are overwhelmed by it all. We didn't know we could connect to each other the way that we can now connect. I remember the first time that I used a hashtag, on Twitter, and it was like mind-blowing that you can connect a global community around something that you are interested in,
yes.
but you never read about in the mainstream newspaper. Whether it's playing the harpsichord, hashtag harpsichord, or hashtag soft power in my case. I found this global community of quite ordinary people, not the ones in the institutions. I knew where to find the institutional ones, but the people just interested in what I'm interested in. These things have been like growing rapidly, massively over 30 years. But because there's no, not yet, we haven't yet found the way to self-organize within all of that, the way that Lalou would describe. Therefore, we're still very, very fragmented. But the rise of energy and interestedness and desire to connect, it's there.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's, for me, that's where I want to invest my time and money. I'm always inviting people to invest, right? Invest is not just, it means put your whole self into it. So in the balance between fixing the old problems and doing the new, for me, you can afford to spend all your time in building the new.
Yes.
Because you in so doing, you will see that you can fix the old in a completely new way than the way it's been presented to you until now.
That's very, very, very powerful. I recall the idea that, when you change the story of your life, you can change your life. And it feels as though we need to create a new story for humanity. And actually, some of these tools, whilst they also cause problems, they enable us to start to think about a more beautiful story that we can create for the future. And to that end, I'd be very interested in your work on this differentiation between hard power and soft power, and in our ability to create those new stories and start to encapsulate a vision for tomorrow that is enticing, that people feel drawn to and aligned with, that they can start to participate in, because it's easy to kind of rally against something, but when you've got something compelling to move towards, then I find it's even more exciting when you have that kind of vision of tomorrow. So could you share a little bit about your work around hard and soft power and how that relates to?
Yeah, absolutely. So because ultimately everything is a story of stories, right? So that's just my top line. When I was you probably realize that I did a lot of work around this conflict resolution and conflict transformation arena. There's a lot of people in that. It's a profession. It's profession of professions, right? And one of the questions that arose, and my mentor was a man called Johan Galtung. Some people will know who that is. Probably not many listening right now, but he was a huge figure in. He founded peace chairs all over the world. So he found peace studies in 5 or 6 universities around the world. And one of his outcrops, if you like, was this idea of peace journalism, where if you use the word peace, actually people will think, oh, something soft and passive and nice, the peace people, right? And they think it's unrealistic because conflict is real and war is real and so on. But the reason he called it peace journalism was because he wanted to draw attention to the fact that in the mainstream, everything is actually war journalism, right? So if a conflict appears, like a strong conflict, immediately we go towards, what we need to do to defend ourselves and what might need to be necessary to contain this conflict. And right behind that, there's this military industrial complex ready to step in and solve the problem of, rising conflict. but you won't read about all the possible routes to overcoming that conflict.
Yes.
You just read about them.
No.
You read about the rising tension.
Mm.
And so therefore, slowly but surely, and Tony Blair was a master of this, you're investing and you're inviting people into this, you're manufacturing the consent, if you like, for war to happen slowly, bit by bit. And so Galtung said, you need to establish a peace journalism, because what we have de facto is war journalism. And that opened my mind to, we spent several years, I was working with two people, Annabelle McGoldrick and Jake Lynch specifically, to establish something called peace journalism, working with many other people. This is just my preamble to, then I went into this period of really thinking, what's the bigger picture of this peace, war and peace journalism, and what is the role of the media in all of that. And I came across a guy called Joseph Nye, who was the man who was working for Bill Clinton in the Kennedy School of Government. And it was just, he started working just after the Americans lost the war against Vietnam. And the story was there. We may have lost that war. We may have lost the war, but we'll never stop being the world's greatest superpower, not because of our hard power, our guns and money, but because of our soft power, right? And he describes soft power as the power of attraction, the story that draws people towards America, and causes them to try to make relationship with America, which gives America influence over everything they do, right? And the fundamental thing that draws people towards America like that, we would describe that as the American dream.
Yes.
The American dream was America's soft power. And what does that mean? It means, anybody moving in America, doesn't matter where they come from, they could become president.
Yes.
Or it's the land of, of endless opportunity. Some people win, other people lose, but it's all down to like your hard work and your ability to have merit of all different kinds. So the American dream was all, and it was delivered by Hollywood and, the idea of democracy. I mean, it was a very powerful story about America, which which was really the source of it being the world's superpower, only world superpower, right? So from studying that and understanding that as a concept was my first step in understanding that the story and narrative actually is more important than the hard power, the guns and the money. And what happened in that 30? I don't know if Joseph and I couldn't have anticipated what happened in that 30-year, this last 30 years, where that has been proven more and more. Because now that people have the power of social media as well, they can tell stories that change the whole global space. So ISIS, to start with a bad example, could come up with a 5-minute video which changed the defense departments of countries the world over. Right? And they did that with such a powerful image and story of like the spectacle of what they would do.
Yes.
Everything.
Yes.
And then Greta Thunberg at the other end, by sitting outside the parliament with her school bag, was capable of changing or stepping up the environmental narrative and changing government policy everywhere. So understanding the power of story is very important, but it's no good just thinking that you can just tell a new story to change the world. It doesn't work like that. And first of all, you have to know what story you're already living in. So that's what I think people really miss. They don't realize that all their whole life, they have been encultured and nurtured in a certain story, which has been crafted by business in a certain way, so that you're really completely in it.
Yes.
To give you a very important example of that is that we are emotional human beings. This is how we're designed to get our emotional needs met. but the products industry business has used advertising and so on to convince us that we'll get our needs met through buying stuff, right? So it's very essential to a human being, to you and to me, Dan, that we have status, right? Status is an essential human need, but business has sold us the idea that we get status through buying stuff.
Yes.
So Nike, Gucci, whatever. And then so that's how we get addicted to consumerism, because we're getting our emotional needs met by this idea of how you get your emotional need met. So story is going on all the time at every level in our minds, and you won't be able to escape that unless you struggle first with your own personal story of who you are and why you're doing what you're doing. First, you have to get to that, right? Because that is yours. That's your story, right? And then you've got to a collective story. Why are we doing what we're doing, and what matters more? And then there's the global aspect of that. I mean, there's a story upon story. And the important thing, I think, is actually understanding the power of story, understanding soft power is more important than coming up with a definitive story, because we won't really do that. I mean, tell me, there's not a story that's going to fit every part of the world. We've got to be a little bit more humble than that, right? Right now, China's busy trying to develop the Chinese dream, and Europe has the European dream. It's like, we're not going to, what's happening in Africa, what's happening in the Middle East, there isn't a story that's going to bring us all together other than stories matter, narrative matters, it is power. When we get that, then each one of us will start to own our own story, and we'll definitely develop good stories all the time, in the same way as a parent has got to tell a good story to a kid about why they've got to eat their vegetables. They'll find it, right? They'll use that. But we could get a little bit distracted with trying to write the definitive story, and be competitive around that. When actually what's important is that you understand the power of story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this plays into like the I, we, and global way of thinking. And I know you talk about cosmo-local, and I think this, to me, recognizes the importance of localized stories as much as it is
yes,
this utopian ideal of having a kind of universal story. And I think even in many ways, religion has attempted to try and create a universal story. But again, that's every religious story has a competitor. You might find some threads. The Integral Way has tried very hard to try and find the commonalities amongst these things, to try and find the universal story, and they have found universal truths. But finding a universal story is something that certainly has eluded us thus far. But I think the importance of those localized stories that are important based upon the conditions of where you exist right now, those are key elements of this, because we've almost, through globalization, tried to create a global storyline, and in fact, as a result, we've lost some of our local storylines. And this is the opportunity to create a new story. And the beautiful thing about what you said is that captivating our own story is part of that. And it takes us full circle to where we began this interview, where I asked you about your adventures and journeys to where you are, and it took writing your book to look back to find those initial stories, so you could claim that story and then start to author the next stage of your story, which leads me to the kind of last question I'd like to ask you about the future of the alternative, and what's the next chapter of the alternative story, and where you're going next with the alternative.
Thank you very much. I mean, our action and agency is to connect things up, really, but also to make, I think, imaginative leaps. It's not it's funny that we didn't know what we were going to do next until we did it, right? And it actually happened that on March the 1st, 2022, it was our 5th birthday, and we thought we have to do something. We didn't know what it was that we were going to do. But when we added all of the things up that we thought we had discovered about what everyone is doing, and all the sort of joining the dots, we could see that it was really really substantial. You know, what is happening now at this kind of fractal level? And what I mean by that is it's not necessarily big, but it's lots and lots of small things of similar patterns beginning to connect up with each other everywhere, holistically. And that word that you said, cosmolocally, so on the ground and connected to the planetary level simultaneously, because the technology is now available, right, to do that. So this cosmolocalism growing exponentially made us really think that we should identify the thing, a future that we all could start to build together. And so we launched on March the 1st this thing that we call Planet A, right? So Planet A is the ground that you are standing on if you can see all of this potential. If you can see how all of this stuff is coming together, you are in fact standing on Planet A. You're no longer standing on the planet that is dying. You're not standing on the one you're trying to escape from, like Elon Musk wants to get to Mars, right? You're actually standing on the future, which we're calling Planet A, but you're not going anywhere. It's right here where you're standing now. It's just we're naming it Planet A. So it's for us, it was a realization moment that if we can ourselves grow together with all these incredible people who are doing all this work right now, this sense that we're already here and the future can emerge from what we're already doing, that's a mindset that we feel is one worth investing in. Let's put it that way. So what it practically consists of is instead of joining the dots on a map of possibility, it's actually joining things together. So how do all these community agency networks, CANs for short, how do they actually start to move into good relationship with each other to generate, a global commons of tools and practice and, story and, because that's the thing that's missing now, is that there's many, many people doing this separately, transition networks, eco-villages, municipalities, neighborocracy. There's so many networks and they're happening everywhere, different parts of the world, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Europe. This pattern is appearing, right? How can you actually physically put them into better contact with each other? That's one thing. And so that they grow that sensibility and that everybody has an opportunity to be part of that, because everyone can walk into a CAN that actually exists on the ground close to them.
Yes.
Simultaneously, in order to do that, but in order to amplify that work, we need this new media system that commits to this. So instead of having a media system we have now, whose main news resource is the party political system and the growth economy, how do we build the media system which has as its main source this regenerative practice that already exists and is growing, right? So that becomes its resource, but how it does it as a media is incredibly inventive, creative, uses all the tricks and tools of the trade, move all of that information into the spaces where people don't have any access to it.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's for me with Elevate is one of our most exciting challenges that we're interested to explore, because we've built this platform off the back of independent media and recognize the power of new media in creating a different story in the way that we've described, but also giving people access to conversations that aren't necessarily available on our TV screens or in our newspapers. And by doing so, I remember when I began on my business journey, one of my early mentors said, "You've got to stop watching CNN." I said, "What do you mean stop watching CNN?" I said, "I don't have CNN." He says, you might not call it CNN, but CNN just means constant negative news. Yeah, you got to tap out of what's going on. You know, you need to know what's going on in the world, but don't immerse yourself in the storylines of other people's stories that are being projected onto the screens, because they are not reality. You've got to go create your own reality and understand the role that you have in making a difference on this earth. And I took that seriously to the point where I actually got rid of my television.
Yeah.
And I was only recently. I mean, we've got a 9-month-old boy now. I mean, he's not going to be watching television, but not as a primary focus. But you know, we got a TV so we could start watching Netflix. We were watching on our laptops. But for 10 years, I had no TV, just tuned out of the news and just focused on you know, the change I wanted to create. And the last 2 years, I've immersed myself in the news, and now find myself in that place of wanting to kind of understand what's important, but focus on building the new. Because you know, if we're all stuck on what's been presented to us on the televisions, then we you know, remain stuck in that space. And I think what you've presented today is the opportunity to think about alternatives, to craft a new storyline, and you built a community that can enable people to do that. And it sounds like we're walking very similar paths. So it's been wonderful to get to know you today and have this beautiful conversation here on the Elevate podcast.
Yeah, me too. Thanks, Dan.
Now, we've had the URL on the screen throughout, so if you haven't picked up on it yet, you can go and check out the alternative at thealternative.org.uk. If our audience would like to find out more about you personally, I know you've got a personal URL as well. Would you like to share that?
Yeah, so that's Indra Adnan, which you can also see on the screen, .global.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. And I encourage our listeners to go and check out the site. The Planet A concept I really like. We've just had Jim Rutt on the show talking about the idea of game A versus game B. And that the game A, the game that we've been playing on this planet, has led to some pretty awful results. As well as, you know, that actually, let me reframe that. It's created some problems in addition to all of the progress we've managed to achieve, and now we need to think about how we play the game differently. Your concept of Planet A, I think, fits really well with that, because it's actually how do we change the way we operate within Planet A. And I think as you discussed, there's lots of different routes to achieving this, and I think it's about connecting the dots and having that possibility for the people at home to say, actually, I'm inspired, I want to get involved, because that's how we go beyond 2% engagement. And you know, that's the exciting part, is people beginning to have this waking up moment, and as a result, looking for vehicles for creating change. And there's an abundance out there, including the alternative, which is wonderful. So it's been great to have you here today on the Elevate podcast, and I hope to continue the conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Dan. And you've just given me another podcast to go and listen to, which when that Jim Rutt one comes out, I'll have a listen.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I think that everything you've told me about your story and your journey, it actually makes me feel really hopeful, because I'm imagining that your listeners will be thinking and feeling that too, and that's why this is this time.
Yes.
This is this time. You know, this is this time. So we're lucky, actually.
Yes, we are. I feel, I mean, as challenging as it may be, and especially when we're kind of immersing ourselves in understanding the problem, understanding the scope of the opportunity to create change is what excites me. It terrifies me and excites me at equal amounts. You know, I think that's but it's what motivates me now. You know, that's the beauty of all of this.
Yeah, and me, and I'm actually excited for my son. He's surrounded by people who think that, you know, his generation has been sold down the river, but I'm saying, gosh, I actually wish I was living in this time as a young person now. So that's for another podcast.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Indra Adnan. We actually planned to cover 5 distinct topics, and we went quite deep today on the polarization of society, which really is such an important subject, because if we really are to create change, then we need to create a mass movement that enables us to really affect that change. However, I'm looking forward to inviting Indra back to the show to talk more about the idea of a parallel polis, a parallel society, and how we can start to build new systems in parallel to build the new in a way that's more attractive than the old, in order to bring people with us. And again, that still requires bringing people together who have different worldviews, different political backgrounds. So today's conversation was mightily important. As I mentioned at the beginning of today's session, Indra will be appearing at Campout this weekend. If you haven't yet got a ticket, you can go to campout.live and find out more about the event and see if it's right for you. We've got a whole program of events over the 4 days, and Elevate are curating the program on Sunday. Now, if you would like to enjoy more conversations like this, then I do hope you'll join our mailing list at danastingregory.com/podcast to send your name and email. It'll take 1 minute of your time. It'll make sure we can reach you in the event that our content is censored, which it regularly is for the controversial nature of the subjects that we're covering. So please go to danastingregory.com/podcast. And you'll also get links about how to access our content on different platforms where you can subscribe on YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble, Apple, Spotify, and a whole host of other platforms. So just a moment of your time, join our mailing list at danastingregory.com/podcast. And until next time, thanks very much for watching. I'm delighted you joined us for this conversation today, and I'll see you soon on the Elevate podcast.